Abigail Harper's hands trembled as she smoothed the faded seams of her mother's old dress, the only one she owned that hadn't been sold. Around her, Virginia's finest daughters preened like prize mares, waiting for Nathaniel Carter's eyes to land on them. They didn't land on them. He walked straight past every powdered face in that ballroom and stopped in front of her. If this story moves you, hit subscribe and stay with me until the very end, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from tonight. I read every single one. The candles in the Carter ballroom burned too bright for a room that cold. Abigail Harper stood near the far wall, half hidden behind a pillar draped in ivy, and watched the daughters of Virginia's wealthiest families circle the floor like gulls waiting for a fish to surface. She wasn't dancing. She hadn't been asked. She hadn't expected to be. Her stepmother, Margaret Harper, stood 20 feet away with Charlotte on her arm, adjusting the girl's ribbon for the third time that hour, whispering something that made Charlotte's cheeks flush pink and pretty. "Stand up straight," Margaret had told Abigail before they left the house. "Smile if anyone looks at you. Try not to remind people you're here." Abigail had said nothing. She never did. Saying something only ever made it worse. She lifted the cup of water someone had abandoned on the windowsill and drank from it slowly, watching the room the way she watched everything from the edges, cataloging who spoke to whom, who avoided whom, who was calculating, and who was merely foolish. It was a habit her father had taught her before he died. Watch first, Abigail. Speak second. The fools go the other way around. Across the room, a hush moved through the crowd like wind through wheat. Nathaniel Carter had arrived. Abigail had never seen him up close. She'd heard the stories, the man who inherited 4,000 acres and buried both his parents before he turned 30, who ran his plantation like a military post, who hadn't smiled at a single social function in the 6 years since he'd returned from the war. Cold, they called him. Untouchable. The women's mothers whispered his worth in dollars before they whispered his name. He moved through the room now, and every girl straightened like a soldier called to attention. Charlotte's hand tightened on Margaret's arm. "He's coming this way," Margaret breathed. Charlotte, look at him. Smile not too wide." Nathaniel Carter walked past Charlotte Harper without a glance. He walked past the Whitfield twins, past Louisa Pemberton, in her new French silk, past every carefully arranged, carefully powdered daughter in that ballroom. And he did not stop until he was standing in front of the pillar, in front of the ivy, in front of Abigail Harper and her water cup and her mother's old dress. The room went silent enough to hear the candles hiss. "Miss Harper," he said. Abigail nearly dropped the cup. She set it down carefully instead, buying herself a second to breathe. "Mr. Carter? I'd be obliged if you'd stand up with me for the first dance." Somewhere behind him, Abigail heard her stepmother's sharp intake of breath, heard the rustle of silk as half the room turned to stare, heard a woman's voice. She thought it might be Louisa Pemberton's mother say, "Him, her," in a tone that wasn't quiet enough. Abigail looked up at him. His face gave her nothing, no warmth, no mockery, no explanation. Just a man waiting for an answer. His jaw set, his eyes steady on hers, like she was the only person in the room worth looking at. "You don't know me, Mr. Carter," she said quietly. "No, ma'am, I don't." "Then why? Does it matter why?" It did. It mattered a great deal. But his hand was already extended, palm up, patient, and every eye in that ballroom was fixed on the space between his fingers and hers. And Abigail understood, with the same clear, cold instinct that had kept her alive in that house for 6 years, that whatever she did next would be talked about in 3 counties by morning. She set her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, firm and certain, and he led her onto the floor without another word. The music started. A slow, formal reel, the kind meant for a room full of people who'd rehearsed their steps since childhood. Abigail hadn't danced in 2 years. She hadn't had reason to, but her body remembered, and Nathaniel Carter moved with the exact, unhurried precision of a man who did nothing by accident. "You're staring at me like I've done something wrong," he said low enough that only she could hear. "You have," Abigail said. "You've made me the most talked-about woman in Virginia for the next month, and you didn't ask if I wanted that." Something almost like amusement crossed his face. Almost. Would you have said yes if I'd asked first? No. Then it's a fair thing I didn't. She missed a step. He caught her elbow, steadied her, didn't comment on it. Why me? She asked. There were 40 women in this room who would have crawled across that floor for your attention. I know. Then why not one of them? Nathaniel's eyes flicked briefly toward the edge of the room, toward Margaret Harper, whose face had gone the color of curdled milk, toward the cluster of mothers already leaning into each other, already trading his name back and forth like a coin they meant to spend. Because you weren't trying, he said. Every other woman in this room has spent the last hour trying to be seen by me. You spent it trying not to be seen at all. That's not a compliment. Wasn't meant as one. It's a fact. He turned her slow, unhurried, his hand steady at her waist. I've had 6 years of women trying to be seen by me, Miss Harper. I'm tired of it. The song ended. He didn't release her hand right away. I'd like to call on you, he said. Tomorrow, with your family's permission. Abigail heard her own heartbeat before she heard her own answer. You don't need my family's permission for anything, Mr. Carter. You could buy this house and everyone in it before breakfast. I could, he agreed. I'd rather ask. He bowed, released her hand and walked away back through the parting crowd, back out the ballroom doors, gone before anyone could stop him for so much as a single word of explanation. The silence he left behind didn't last long. Margaret Harper crossed the floor in 4 furious steps, her fingers closing around Abigail's wrist like a manacle. What did you say to him? Nothing, Abigail said. He asked. I answered. You must have said something, done something. I stood by a pillar and drank water, Mother. That's the whole of it. Charlotte appeared at Margaret's shoulder, her pretty face pale and confused, not unkind. Charlotte was never unkind, but bewildered the way a child is bewildered when the world stops making sense. He didn't even look at me, she said, quiet almost to herself. I stood right there. He didn't even look. He will, Margaret said, sharp, already recalculating, already 3 moves ahead the way she always was. This is nothing, a whim. Men like Nathaniel Carter don't marry women like... She stopped herself, but not soon enough. Women like me, Abigail finished for her. Margaret's mouth pressed into a thin line. You know what I mean. Abigail did know. She'd known it every day for 6 years, since her father died, and left them with a name and no money to hold it up since Margaret had moved into the role of widow in charge with the efficiency of a woman who'd been planning it for longer than anyone realized. Abigail had learned to expect nothing, want nothing, take up as little space as a person could take up while still occupying a room. And now the coldest man in the county had walked past 40 eligible women to put his hand out for hers. The carriage ride home was silent until it wasn't. He'll come tomorrow, and he'll see reason, Margaret said, staring out the window at the dark fields rolling past. A man like that doesn't choose a penniless girl over an heiress. There's something else at work. There has to be. Maybe he simply liked her, Charlotte said softly. Men like Nathaniel Carter don't like Charlotte. They calculate. Margaret's eyes cut to Abigail, sharp and assessing in the dim light. What do you know that I don't? Nothing, Mother. Don't lie to me. I'm not lying. Abigail kept her voice even, kept her hands folded, kept every part of herself still the way she'd trained it to be still. I've never spoken 2 words to that man in my life before tonight. Margaret studied her for a long moment, the way she studied ledgers, looking for the number that didn't add up. Then she sat back against the seat, and something in her face shifted, not softened, never softened, but adjusted, recalibrated to a new set of facts. If he comes tomorrow, she said, you will receive him properly. You will wear the blue dress, not this rag. You will smile, and you will not under any circumstance mention the debts. Abigail's stomach turned cold. What debts? None of your concern, Mother. I said none of your concern. Margaret's voice sharpened into something Abigail recognized, something that had lived in that house since her father's funeral. A hardness that came out whenever the money was mentioned and vanished the moment it wasn't needed. Just do as you're told for once in your life, Abigail. This family cannot afford your pride." Abigail said nothing, but she filed it away the way she filed everything. What debts? How much? How long? A small cold seed of dread planted somewhere beneath her ribs. Bad. She didn't sleep that night. She lay awake in the small back room she'd occupied since Margaret decided the larger rooms suited Charlotte better, staring at the ceiling, replaying his hand extended toward hers, palm up, patient. Does it matter why? It did matter. It mattered more than he understood, more than anyone in that ballroom understood. Because Abigail Harper had learned in 6 years of being overlooked exactly what happened to girls who were suddenly inexplicably seen. It never ended well. Someone always wanted something. She heard footsteps in the hall near midnight light, careful the particular rhythm of someone trying not to wake the house. A knock soft at her door. "Miss Abigail." Mrs. Brooks's voice hushed. The housekeeper had been with the family longer than Margaret had, longer than Abigail had been alive, and she was the only person in that house who still called Abigail Miss, like she meant it. Abigail opened the door. Mrs. Eleanor Brooks stood in the hallway with a single candle, her gray hair loose from its pins, her face drawn with something that looked like worry. "I heard what happened tonight," she said. "The whole kitchen's talking of nothing else." "It was nothing, Mrs. Brooks. A dance." "Wasn't nothing, and you know it." The older woman stepped inside, pulled the door nearly shut behind her, lowered her voice further still. "Nathaniel Carter doesn't do things without reason, child. That man plans every breath he takes. You want to be careful." "Careful of what?" Mrs. Brooks hesitated. In the candlelight, her face looked older than Abigail had ever seen it. "There's talk," she said finally, "among the staff, that your mother's been to see Mr. Pruitt 3 times this month." Abigail's chest tightened. Josiah Pruitt was the family's lawyer, had been since her father's death, handling what little remained of the estate, the small allowance that kept the household running on threadbare dignity. 3 times, Abigail repeated. "Why?" "I don't know for certain, but I know your father's land wasn't free and clear when he passed, and I know your mother's been selling off pieces of it quiet like these past 2 years, and I know a woman doesn't visit her lawyer 3 times in a month unless something's come due." The cold seed beneath Abigail's ribs sprouted roots. "You think that's why," Abigail said slowly. "You think Mother's trying to—" "I think," Mrs. Brooks said carefully, "that a desperate woman will use whatever's in her reach. And tonight, child, the whole county saw the richest man in Virginia reach for you." She squeezed Abigail's hand, her grip surprisingly strong for a woman her age. "I don't know what Mr. Carter wants, but you make certain before you give him anything that you know what your mother's already promised him on your behalf." She left as quietly as she'd come, taking the candle with her, leaving Abigail alone in the dark. Abigail didn't sleep. She sat at the small window instead, watching the black shapes of the fields beyond, turning it all over the debts, the lawyer. Her mother's careful, sudden concern that she wear the blue dress and mind her tongue. Nathaniel Carter had looked at her tonight like she was the only true thing in a room full of performance. But performances had a way of being arranged long before the curtain rose, and Abigail had learned at great cost never to trust a stage she hadn't built herself. He came at 10 o'clock the next morning, exactly as he'd said he would. Abigail heard the carriage before she saw it, heard Margaret's voice pitch high and bright in the front hall, heard Charlotte's soft, uncertain footsteps on the stairs, heard the low murmur of a man who did not waste words being shown into the parlor. She stood at the top of the staircase in the blue dress Margaret had forced upon her, her hair pinned the way Margaret had insisted, and looked down at Nathaniel Carter, standing in the hallway of her father's house, holding his hat in both hands, looking for the first time since she'd met him, faintly uncertain. He looked up, found her on the stairs, and for one unguarded moment something moved across his face that wasn't calculation at all. "Miss Harper," he said. "Mr. Carter." She came down the stairs slowly, aware of Margaret watching from the parlor doorway, aware of every possible debt her mother might already have signed away in her name. "I understand you asked permission to call." "I did." "And did my mother grant it?" "She did." His eyes stayed on hers, steady, unreadable. though I confess, I'd have come regardless." Behind him in the parlor, Abigail caught the edge of her mother's smile, sharp, satisfied, the smile of a woman who'd just watched a very valuable piece move exactly where she'd hoped it would go. Abigail looked back at Nathaniel Carter, at his careful hands, and his steady eyes, and his 6 years of grief no one in that room understood, and she thought, "I do not know yet if you are my rescue or my ruin." But she extended her hand anyway and let him take it. Nathaniel Carter came back the next day, and the day after that. By the end of the second week, the whole county had stopped asking whether he was courting Abigail Harper, and started asking why. "You'll wear him down eventually," Margaret said one morning, watching from the parlor window as his carriage rolled up the drive for the 5th time in 9 days. She said it the way she said most things to Abigail lately, sideways, without quite looking at her, as though Abigail were a horse she was calculating the worth of. "Men like that don't keep calling on a woman unless they mean something by it. Or unless they're bored," Abigail said. "Nathaniel Carter has never been bored a day in his life. That man doesn't know how." Abigail said nothing. She'd learned in 2 weeks that arguing with her mother about Nathaniel only made Margaret more certain she was right, and more certain meant more scheming. And more scheming meant Abigail spent her nights lying awake trying to guess which direction the next blow would come from. She went out to meet him on the porch instead of waiting for him to be shown in. It had become a habit meeting him outside, away from Margaret's ears, away from Charlotte's wounded, watchful eyes. "You're Zhao," she said. It was barely 10. Couldn't sleep. He helped her down the porch steps without being asked, his hand steady under her elbow, a gesture that had stopped feeling strange somewhere around the 4th visit. "Walk with me." They walked the same path they always walked along the fence line that separated the Harper land from the Carter land, a boundary that had once meant something and now meant considerably less, given how much of the Harper land had quietly changed hands in the last 2 years. "You've been quiet the last few days," Nathaniel said. "I'm always quiet. Not like this." He stopped walking, turned to face her fully, the way he did when he wanted an honest answer and intended to wait for one. "Something's troubling you, Miss Harper. I'd like to know what." Abigail looked at the fence line instead of at him. It was easier that way, easier to be honest with a piece of split-rail wood than with a man whose eyes seemed to see straight through every careful thing she tried to arrange on her face. "Do you know Josiah Pruitt?" she asked. Something shifted in Nathaniel's expression, small, contained, but there. "The lawyer. I know of him. My mother's been to see him 3 times this month. That's not unusual for a widow managing an estate." "No," Abigail agreed. "It isn't. Except my mother doesn't manage anything if she can help it. She delegates. She complains. She has never once in 6 years driven herself into town to sit across from a man in an office and discuss numbers." Abigail finally looked up at him. "Something's wrong, Mr. Carter. I don't know what, but I know the shape of it even if I can't see the whole thing yet." Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Abigail felt the silence start to ache. "If I asked you to trust me," he said finally, "would you? I don't know you well enough to trust you." "Fair." He almost smiled, the ghost of one there and gone. "Would you trust me to find out what your mother's hiding, even if I can't promise you'll like the answer?" Abigail studied him. 2 weeks of careful, patient calls. 2 weeks of a man who asked questions and actually waited for the answers, who touched her elbow like she might break and spoke to her like she wouldn't. It wasn't trust. Not yet. But it was something close enough to lean on. "Yes," she said. "Find out." Duh. He didn't have to look far. 3 days later, Nathaniel rode into town under the pretense of business at the mill, and instead walked straight into Josiah Pruitt's office and closed the door behind him. Pruitt was a thin, nervous man who'd spent 30 years drawing up wills and deeds for families who mostly ignored him until they needed him desperately, and the sight of Nathaniel Carter filling his doorway made him go pale in a way that told Nathaniel everything before either of them said a word. "Mr. Carter? I wasn't expecting—" "I imagine not." Nathaniel didn't sit. He rarely did in rooms where he intended to be brief. "I'll ask you once plainly, and I'd take it as a kindness if you answered the same way. What does Margaret Harper owe and to whom?" Pruitt's hands found each other on the desk, twisting. "Mr. Carter, that's a private matter between myself and my client. Your client is drowning, Pruitt. I've seen the state of that land. Half of it's been sold off in pieces so small the buyers barely noticed what they were losing. Which tells me she's desperate enough to take whatever price she can get without drawing attention to the sales. That's not the behavior of a woman managing an estate. That's the behavior of a woman 2 steps ahead of ruin." Nathaniel leaned forward, both hands flat on the desk. "I'm not asking to hurt anyone. I'm asking because I intend to marry into that family, and I'd rather walk in with my eyes open than be handed a debt I didn't agree to." The word marry hung in the air between them, and Pruitt's whole posture changed. The fear replaced briefly by something like relief, like a man who'd been carrying a weight alone for months and had just been offered a hand to help lift it. $11,000, Pruitt said quietly. "To a man named Silas Reeves out of Charleston. Her late husband borrowed against the land before he died, a bad investment in a shipping venture that went under. Mrs. Harper's been paying the interest by selling off acreage, but the principal comes due in full this October. If she can't pay it, Reeves takes the house. Reeves takes everything. The house, what's left of the land, and whatever furniture and effects aren't nailed down." Pruitt's voice dropped further. "There's something else, Mr. Carter. Something I probably oughtn't tell you, but given your intentions, tell me. Reeves has a nephew, unmarried. Mrs. Harper's been in correspondence with the family since spring discreetly. I believe—" Pruitt hesitated, chose his words with obvious care. "I believe she's been trying to arrange a marriage between the nephew and one of her daughters, as a means of settling the debt without losing the property." Nathaniel went very still. "Which daughter?" Pruitt looked at him, and something passed between the two men that didn't need to be spoken aloud. "I don't know for certain," Pruitt said. "But Reeves's letters have mentioned Miss Harper by name. Not Miss Charlotte." He swallowed. "Miss Abigail." Nathaniel rode back from town with his jaw set so hard it ached, turning the information over the whole way, fitting pieces together that had been sitting loose and unexplained since the night of the ballroom. The blue dress. Smile if anyone looks at you. Don't mention the debts. Margaret Harper hadn't been surprised that Nathaniel chose Abigail. She'd been relieved because a wealthy, unattached suitor showing sudden interest in her least valuable daughter solved a problem Margaret had been quietly trying to solve for months with a stranger from Charleston. Abigail wasn't being courted. She was being sold twice over and didn't even know it. He found Abigail in the garden behind the house, sitting on the low stone wall with a book she wasn't reading, and the moment she saw his face, she stood. "You found something." "I did." He told her plainly, the debt, the deadline, Silas Reeves, the nephew, the letters. He watched her face while he spoke, watched the color leave it, slowly watched her hands curl into the fabric of her skirt. "She's selling me?" Abigail said when he finished. Her voice was very quiet and very flat, the voice of someone working hard to keep something enormous from breaking loose. "She's been arranging it since spring, behind my back, to a man I've never met, to settle a debt my father made before he died, and she never once thought to tell me." "Abigail, don't." She held up a hand, not unkindly, just steadying herself. "I need a moment." He gave her the moment. He'd learned in 2 weeks that she didn't want comfort handed to her before she'd finished feeling the thing that needed feeling. She sat back down on the wall, staring at nothing, and Nathaniel stood beside her in silence until her breathing evened out. "October," she said finally. "That's 4 months. 4 months for her to secure the payment or secure the marriage." Nathaniel sat beside her close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "Which means, if I'm right, she's going to be watching very carefully to see whether I intend to actually offer for you, or whether I'm simply a diversion she can use to stall the Reeves family while she keeps her options open." Abigail turned to look at him. "And which is it?" "You know which it is." "Say it anyway." Something in his face softened just slightly, just enough. "I don't call on a woman 5 times in 9 days because I'm undecided, Miss Harper. I've never been an undecided man in my life." It should have comforted her. Instead, a new and colder fear moved through Abigail's chest. If she finds out you know about the debt, if she finds out you know about Reeves, she'll accelerate everything. She won't wait for October if she thinks she's losing control of the situation. Then we don't tell her what we know. We, Nathaniel said, and there was something almost fierce in the way he said it. Something that didn't match the cold, controlled man the whole county whispered about. "You're not facing this alone, Abigail. Not anymore." It was the first time he'd used her given name. The trouble was, Margaret Harper wasn't a fool, and foolish men were considerably easier to outmaneuver. She noticed the shift almost immediately, the new steadiness in Abigail's spine, the way her daughter had stopped flinching at the mention of Mr. Pruitt. The quiet, careful confidence that had crept into her posture over the last week, like something rebuilt from the inside out. "You know something," Margaret said one evening, cornering Abigail in the upstairs hallway with a candle and a look that had frightened Abigail since childhood. "Don't lie to me, Abigail. I raised you enough years to know when you're hiding something." "You didn't raise me," Abigail said. "You inherited me. There's a difference." Margaret's hand cracked across her face before either of them seemed to realize it was happening. The silence afterward was worse than the slap. Margaret stared at her own hand like it belonged to a stranger. Abigail didn't move. Didn't cry out, just stood there with her cheek burning and her eyes steady, and something in that stillness seemed to frighten Margaret more than any scream could have. "I didn't mean—" Margaret started. "Yes, you did." Abigail's voice was low-controlled years of practiced calm, holding the line against the roar underneath it. "You've meant every unkind thing you've ever said or done to me since Father died, Mother. The only difference tonight is you finally let your hand catch up to your intentions. You don't understand what I'm trying to protect. I understand exactly what you're trying to protect. I understand you've spent months writing letters to a man named Silas Reeves in Charleston, discussing his nephew, discussing me, discussing a debt Father left behind that you never once thought to mention in 6 years of watching me go without a new dress, without a proper meal, some winters, without so much as a kind word." Abigail watched her mother's face drain of color in the candlelight. "I understand everything, Mother. I've understood for days." Margaret's mouth opened-closed. For the first time in Abigail's memory, the woman seemed to have run entirely out of things to say. "How?" "It doesn't matter how. What matters is that I know, and I'm done being a piece on your board, moved wherever it's convenient for you to move me." Abigail stepped back, putting distance between them, her hand rising briefly to the mark still warming on her cheek. "You will not sell me to a stranger in Charleston to settle Father's debts. I'd rather see this family lose the house entirely than spend the rest of my life paying for a mistake I didn't make." "You foolish, ungrateful girl." Margaret's composure cracked entirely, now her voice climbing toward something raw and desperate. "Do you think Nathaniel Carter is going to marry you? Do you truly believe that? A man like that, with everything he has, choosing a penniless girl in a borrowed dress? He is amusing himself, Abigail. He will grow bored within the season and move on to some heiress from Richmond, and you will be left with nothing, no reputation, no prospects, and a debt still hanging over this family that will drag you down with the rest of us. Then that will be my choice to make, not yours. You don't have the luxury of choices. None of us do. Your father saw to that, the day he signed his name to that shipping venture and left us all to drown in the wreckage of his optimism." Margaret's voice cracked, and for one unguarded second, Abigail saw something underneath the cruelty exhaustion. Terror. 6 years of a woman trying to keep a sinking house afloat with nothing but her wits and her daughters as currency. "I have spent every day since his funeral trying to save what's left of this family, and you stand there and call me a monster for it." "I never called you a monster." Abigail's voice softened just slightly, just enough to let the truth through. "I called you someone who was willing to sell me to save herself. Those aren't the same accusation, Mother. but they're close enough that I don't know how to forgive you for it yet." She turned and walked back to her room, closing the door quietly behind her, and did not cry until she was certain her mother couldn't hear it through the wall. Nathaniel noticed the mark on her cheek the next morning before she'd even finished her greeting. Who did that? It wasn't a question. His voice had dropped into something low and dangerous that Abigail hadn't heard from him before, something that made the porch boards feel suddenly very small beneath them. "It doesn't matter. It matters to me." He was in front of her now, his hand rising toward her face and stopping just short of touching, as though he needed permission for even that much. "Tell me." "My mother." Abigail said it plainly, because there was no point pretending otherwise, not to a man who'd already proven he could see straight through her careful arrangements. "We argued. I told her I knew about Reeves, about the letters." Something moved across Nathaniel's face, controlled but only barely a muscle working in his jaw, his hand curling into a fist at his side before he consciously released it. "I should go speak with her." "No." Abigail caught his sleeve before he could turn toward the house. "That will only make everything worse. She's frightened, Nathaniel. Frightened people do frightening things. If you go in there and threaten her, she'll only dig in harder and she'll drag Reeves into this faster than she already intends to." "You're defending her." "I'm not defending her. I'm telling you what I know to be true about how she thinks." Abigail's grip on his sleeve loosened, but she didn't let go entirely. "I need you to trust me on this. Please." Nathaniel looked down at her hand on his arm, then up at her face, and something in his expression settled slowly, like a man setting down a weapon he hadn't realized he was holding. "All right," he said, "but if she raises her hand to you again—" "She won't." "You don't know that." "No," Abigail admitted. "But I know that if you march in there today demanding accountings, she'll have Reeves's family here within the week to formalize whatever arrangement she can salvage before you and I can stop it. I need time. We need time." Nathaniel exhaled slow and finally nodded. "Then we make time. I'll speak to my own lawyer this week quietly. If your father's debt can be bought outright, bought and settled before October, then Reeves has no leverage left to offer, and your mother has no bargain left to make. You'd do that, pay off my father's debt. I'd do considerably more than that." He said it simply, without any of the performance Abigail had come to expect from men who wanted something from her. But let's start there. The debt was not, as it turned out, so easily bought. Silas Reeves, when approached discreetly through Nathaniel's own attorney the following week, declined the offer to sell the note outright. Politely. Firmly. With the unmistakable air of a man who understood he was holding something more valuable than $11,000. "He doesn't want the money," Nathaniel told Abigail grimly, standing in the same spot along the fence line where they'd first spoken of the debt 2 weeks before. "He wants the marriage. His nephew's been passed over twice by families with better prospects, and Reeves sees this as his chance to marry the boy into land and respectability, without spending a cent more than what's already owed to him. So he refuses to be bought off. He refuses. My lawyer offered $15,000, $4,000 above the debt itself as an incentive to walk away clean. Reeves turned it down without hesitation." Nathaniel's hands gripped the top rail of the fence, knuckles pale. "Which tells me this was never only about the money. He wants the connection to Virginia land, and he's decided you're his easiest path to it." Abigail felt something cold settle low in her stomach. "Then what do? We change the terms of the argument." Nathaniel turned to face her fully. "If he won't sell the debt, we make certain there's nothing left for him to collect on. Your mother's already sold most of the outlying acreage to cover the interest these past 2 years. What remains, the house, the home lot, isn't enough to satisfy an $11,000 note, which means come October, if the principal isn't paid, Reeves takes what's there, and the remainder becomes a debt of person, not property, a debt your mother will feel obligated to settle through marriage because she'll have nothing else left to offer him." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "I won't let that happen. But I need you to understand something, Abigail, and I need you to hear it plainly, without dressing it up in anything softer than the truth. Tell me." The fastest way to end this, to end it completely, so there's no leverage left for your mother or for Reeves or for anyone else, is for us to marry before October. Not for show, not as a rescue, but because a married woman's debts become her husband's to settle, and no man in Charleston is going to argue property rights against Carter land. He held her gaze steadily. I'm not asking you tonight. I'm telling you what's true, and I'm asking you to sit with it. And when you're ready, if you're ever ready, I'll ask you properly. Abigail's heart was hammering hard enough that she was certain he could hear it. You'd marry me to save me from a debt I didn't create. I'd marry you because I've spent 3 weeks discovering that you are the most honest, most steady, most quietly courageous woman I have ever met, and the debt is simply the reason we don't have the luxury of time to pretend otherwise. His voice had dropped rough at the edges, in a way she hadn't heard from him before. I am not a romantic man, Abigail. I don't have pretty words for this. But I know what I want, and I have known it since the night I watched you drink water alone by a pillar, while 40 women performed for my attention. I want you, not the solution to your mother's debt. You. Abigail stood very still, the fence rail cool under her hand, the summer evening pressing warm and heavy around them, and for one long moment she let herself simply feel the astonishing weight of being chosen, not calculated for, not managed, not sold, but chosen by a man who'd had no reason to look twice at her and had looked anyway. I need to think, she said finally. Take whatever time you need. Not long, she admitted, and something like a smile touched the corner of her mouth for the first time in days. Just enough to be certain I'm saying yes for my own reasons, and not because I'm frightened of Silas Reeves. Nathaniel nodded slow, and something in his face, that careful, guarded thing he wore like armor, cracked open just slightly, just for her. Take all the time that requires. She did not have as much time as either of them hoped. 3 days later, a letter arrived at the Harper house, bearing a Charleston postmark, and Margaret's hands shook so badly reading it that Charlotte had to steady her arm. What is it? Charlotte asked. Mother, what's wrong? Margaret didn't answer at first. She read the letter twice, her face shifting through something like panic and something like calculation in quick succession, before she finally looked up and found Abigail standing in the parlor doorway. Mr. Reeves is coming, Margaret said, with his nephew. They'll arrive within the fortnight. The room went cold. You told me October, Abigail said. You told me the debt wasn't due until October. The debt isn't. Margaret's voice had gone thin, brittle. But apparently Mr. Reeves has grown impatient waiting for a formal arrangement, and word has reached him. She stopped, and something flickered across her face that Abigail recognized immediately. Guilt. Word of what? Word that another man has been courting you, Margaret said. He believes I've been stalling him. He's coming to settle the matter directly before your Mr. Carter can interfere any further. Charlotte's eyes went wide. You told him about Abigail and Mr. Carter. I told him nothing. Someone else. Margaret's composure snapped her hand, crumpling the letter in her fist. It doesn't matter who told him. What matters is he's coming, and he'll expect an arrangement to be presented formally in front of both families, and if there's nothing to present, he'll call the note due immediately and take the house before the harvest is even in. Abigail felt the floor tilt beneath her. 2 weeks. She'd asked Nathaniel for time to be certain, and now the fortnight had collapsed down into something far more urgent, far more dangerous, with a stranger from Charleston already on his way to claim what her mother had all but promised him. I need to speak with Mr. Carter, Abigail said. There's no time for... There is time. Abigail said sharper than she'd ever spoken to her mother in her life. Because I am not going to stand in this parlor in a fortnight and be presented to a man I've never met like a horse at auction. I would rather burn this house to the ground myself. She was already moving toward the door before Margaret could answer, already reaching for her shawl, already thinking through every word she needed to say to Nathaniel Carter before Silas Reeves's carriage ever reached the county line. She found him at the Carter stables, sleeves rolled to the elbow, helping one of his men with a lame horse, and the moment he saw her face, he dropped what he was doing entirely. What happened? Reeves is coming, within the fortnight. He's heard about you about us, and he means to settle the matter before you can interfere further." Abigail's breath came fast, half from the walk, half from the fear she'd been holding steady since the letter arrived. "There's no more time to be certain, Nathaniel. There's no more time to sit with anything." Nathaniel wiped his hands on a cloth, slow and deliberate, giving himself a moment to think, even as every line of his body had gone taut. "Then we don't wait for him to arrive." "What do you mean?" "I mean we go to your mother today, and I make my intentions plain, not as a rumor for Reeves to hear secondhand, but as a fact signed and witnessed that leaves him no room to argue when he does arrive." He set the cloth down, stepped closer, took both her hands in his without hesitation. "Abigail, I told you I'd ask you properly when you were ready. I don't think either of us has the luxury of waiting for perfect timing anymore. So I'm asking you now, in a stable, with dirt on my hands and no ring in my pocket, because the alternative is letting a stranger from Charleston decide your future for you." Abigail's heart was pounding so hard she could barely hear her own thoughts over it. "Ask me then." "Marry me," Nathaniel said, "not to spite Reeves, not only to settle a debt. Marry me because I have spent 3 weeks learning who you are underneath everything this county tried to convince me you weren't, and I have never wanted anything the way I want to spend the rest of my life finding out what else there is to learn." Somewhere behind them, one of the stable hands had gone very quiet, very interested, and would no doubt have the story halfway to town before supper. Abigail didn't care. "Yes," she said. The word came out steadier than she expected, steadier than she felt, and Nathaniel's whole face changed when he heard it, the careful control breaking apart into something raw and relieved, and for just a moment, almost boyish. "Yes?" she said again, because the first time hadn't felt real enough to be believed. "Yes, Nathaniel, I'll marry you." He didn't kiss her. Not there, not with an audience of stable hands and lame horses and dust-hanging gold in the afternoon light. But he pressed his forehead briefly to hers, his hands still holding hers between them, and said low enough that it was only for her, "Then let's go tell your mother before Reeves gets the chance to hear it from anyone else." Margaret Harper did not take the news with grace. "Married," she said, staring between the two of them in the parlor doorway, her voice climbing toward something shrill. "Married just like that, with no banns read, no proper courtship, no—" "3 weeks is not improper by any measure that matters," Nathaniel said evenly. "And I intend to have the banns read this Sunday publicly, so there's no question in anyone's mind, including Mr. Reeves's, about where matters stand. Reeves will be furious. He'll call the note immediately. Let him." Nathaniel's voice hardened. "The moment Abigail and I are married, her debts become mine to settle, and I will settle your late husband's note in full the day the ceremony concludes. Reeves will have his money. He simply won't have his nephew's marriage to show for it, and I imagine that's the part that will sting him considerably more than the principle itself." Margaret's mouth opened, closed, opened again. For a woman who'd spent 6 years staying 3 moves ahead of every crisis, she looked for the first time entirely out of moves. "You'd pay the whole debt," she said slowly. "Even knowing what I tried to do. I'm not marrying you, Mrs. Harper. I'm marrying your daughter, and I intend to see her free of every obligation you've spent years quietly accumulating on her behalf." His eyes didn't waver. "That includes the debt. It does not include forgiveness for how you've treated her these past 6 years. That's a separate matter, and one I imagine will take considerably longer to settle." Margaret's eyes flickered to Abigail, searching, calculating, and then for one unguarded second, something that looked almost like shame. "I did what I thought I had to," she said quietly. "I know," Abigail said. "It wasn't forgiveness, but it was perhaps the beginning of something that might one day resemble it. But you never once asked me what I wanted, Mother. Not in 6 years. That's the part I don't know how to forgive yet." Charlotte, who had been standing silent in the corner through the entire exchange, finally spoke, her voice small but steady. "I'm glad it's you," she told Abigail. "I never wanted him. I never wanted any of it. I just wanted someone to ask me to for once." The words landed heavier than Charlotte likely intended, and Margaret's face crumpled slightly at the sound of them, the first genuine crack Abigail had seen in her mother's composure since the night of the ballroom. "Then perhaps," Nathaniel said quietly, "it's time someone did." Silas Reeves arrived 11 days later to find the banns already read, twice the wedding already fixed for the following month, and a letter waiting for him at the county clerk's office, confirming that the Harper debt would be settled in full with interest upon the marriage of Nathaniel Carter and Abigail Harper. He did not take it well. He arrived at the Harper house uninvited, his nephew trailing behind him, looking considerably more relieved than disappointed, and demanded to see Margaret directly, his voice carrying clear through the open windows into the garden, where Abigail sat with Nathaniel watching the whole confrontation unfold from a careful distance. "This is a fraud," Reeves was shouting. "An arrangement built specifically to cheat me out of what I was promised." "You were promised nothing, Mr. Reeves." Margaret's voice answered steadier than Abigail had heard it in weeks. "You were owed a debt, and that debt will be paid in full with interest the moment my daughter marries. I made you no promise beyond that whatever you believed you'd secured through private correspondence. We had an understanding. You had a hope," Margaret said. "There's a difference, and I'd advise you to learn it before you make the mistake of shouting it in my front garden again." Abigail, listening from the bench beside Nathaniel, felt something unexpected move through her, not quite pride, not yet, but something close to it. Whatever else her mother was, whatever damage 6 years of desperation had done there, was still underneath it a woman capable of standing her ground when it finally mattered. "He'll leave," Nathaniel said quietly, watching the exchange with something almost like satisfaction. "There's nothing left for him here. The debt's already settled in principle. He came expecting a bride, and he's leaving with a bank draft instead. Small comfort, I imagine, for a man who thought he'd secured land and respectability for the price of an old debt." "Small comfort," Nathaniel agreed. "But it's more than he deserved for treating you like a line item in a ledger." Reeves left within the hour, his nephew's relief plainly visible even from a distance, and the carriage that carried him away kicked up dust along the drive that Abigail watched settle slowly back onto the road, carrying with it the last thread of the threat that had hung over her since the night of the ballroom. She should have felt only relief. Instead, sitting beside Nathaniel in the quiet garden, she felt something far more complicated, the beginning of a life she'd never let herself imagine built now on the wreckage of a crisis that had, however, painfully forced her mother and sister into something closer to honesty than they'd managed in years. "It's not over," she said quietly. "No," Nathaniel agreed. "Reeves is gone, but the county will talk about this marriage for months, about why a man like me chose a woman like you, about whether it was pity or calculation, or something else entirely. Some of them won't be kind about it." "I know. I need you to be ready for that." He turned to look at her, serious, now the playfulness of the afternoon settling into something graver. "There will be people at our wedding who come only to see whether it's real. And there will be people after our wedding who spend years trying to decide whether you deserve to stand where you're standing." Abigail thought of 40 women in a ballroom, waiting to be chosen, and thought of herself standing quietly by a pillar, expecting nothing. She thought of her mother's hand across her face, and Charlotte's small, honest confession in the parlor, and Silas Reeves's carriage disappearing down the drive with nothing to show for months of careful scheming. "Let them look," she said. "I spent 6 years being invisible in that ballroom's eyes, and every room like it. I'm not frightened of being seen anymore." Nathaniel took her hand, quiet and certain, and said nothing more. He didn't need to. Whatever waited for them beyond that garden, the wedding, the whispers, the long work of building something real out of what had begun as rescue, they would meet it together, and for the first time since her father died, Abigail Harper believed fully and without reservation that she would not be facing it alone. The wedding was fixed for the second Saturday in August, and for 2 weeks, the Harper house buzzed with a kind of frantic, unfamiliar activity that Abigail didn't quite know how to inhabit. Seamstresses came and went. Margaret, restored to something like her old efficiency, now that the crisis with Reeves had passed, threw herself into the planning with an energy that felt less like joy and more like penance, as though she believed she could sew her way back into her daughter's good graces, one careful stitch at a time. Abigail let her. It cost nothing to let her mother feel useful, and there was, underneath the awkwardness, something Abigail recognized as an apology too large for words offered instead through fittings and flowers, and the careful selection of lace. Charlotte had changed too in the week since the confrontation with Reeves. She'd taken to seeking Abigail out in quiet moments in the garden, on the stairs in the hour before supper, not to talk about the wedding, but simply to talk the way sisters were supposed to talk and never quite had. "I used to envy you," Charlotte admitted one evening, sitting on the edge of Abigail's bed while a seamstress pinned the hem of the wedding dress. "Isn't that strange? Mother always said you were the plain one, the forgotten one, and I still envied you." "Envied me for what? You never had to try." Charlotte's fingers picked at a loose thread on the coverlet. "I've spent my whole life being arranged. My hair, my dresses, my conversation, all of it managed so carefully so I'd catch the right eye. You got to just be yourself, even when it meant being overlooked." "I didn't feel fortunate," Abigail said quietly. "I felt invisible." "I know. I'm not saying it was better." Charlotte looked up, her young face uncharacteristically serious. "I'm saying I think being invisible and being managed are both a kind of prison, and neither of us got to choose which one we were locked in." Abigail reached over and squeezed her sister's hand, and for the first time in years, the gesture didn't feel performed. It felt true. It was into this fragile, newly mended piece that Mrs. Brooks arrived at Abigail's door on a Tuesday evening, a small wooden box in her hands, and an expression that made Abigail's stomach drop before a single word was spoken. "I found this cleaning out the attic," the housekeeper said, setting the box on the bed between them. "Your father's old correspondence. Most of it's nothing, receipts, letters from your grandmother, that sort of thing. But there's something in here you'll want to see before your wedding day, child. I thought long on whether to show you at all. Decided you'd rather know than not." Abigail opened the box with careful hands. Beneath a layer of old receipts and a faded daguerreotype of her father as a young man, she found a bundle of letters tied with ribbon, gone brittle with age, and on top of them, a single folded document that made her breath catch the moment she recognized the seal. "Carter." "That's a Carter seal," she said slowly. "It is." Abigail unfolded the letter with trembling fingers and read it once. Then again, the words rearranging themselves in her mind into something that made her sick. It was a letter from Josiah Carter, Nathaniel's father, dated 11 years earlier, addressed to her own father. A land dispute. A boundary claim along the river frontage that both families had contested for a generation, resolved finally according to the letter by a survey commissioned jointly and paid for equally. Except the letter that followed it, tucked behind the first, was not addressed to her father at all. It was a private note from Josiah Carter to his own lawyer, dated the same week, instructing the man to ensure the survey favored Carter land by whatever margin could be reasonably disputed, and noting coldly, plainly, that Harper hasn't the resources to contest it in court and won't discover the discrepancy before the deed is filed. "He cheated him," Abigail whispered. "Nathaniel's father cheated my father. Out of land. Out of—" She looked up at Mrs. Brooks, understanding arriving in pieces, each one worse than the last. "This is why we started losing ground, isn't it? Not just the shipping venture. This river frontage was some of the best farmland Father had. If it was taken from him unfairly—" "I don't know the whole of it," Mrs. Brooks said gently. "I only know what's in that letter, and I know your father never spoke of it, not once. Not even when things got hardest. Whether out of pride or grief, I couldn't say." Abigail sat very still, the letter trembling slightly in her hand, and felt something she hadn't expected to feel on the eve of her own wedding. A cold, creeping doubt about the family she was about to join. She didn't sleep that night, and by morning she'd made a decision that felt less like a choice and more like a necessity too large to avoid. She had to tell Nathaniel. She found him at the stables again, the same place he always seemed to be when the day was young and his mind was heavy, and the moment he saw her face, he set down the bridle in his hands and came to her without being asked. "What's happened?" Abigail held out the letters. She didn't trust her voice enough to explain first. He read them standing in the aisle between the stalls, his face going through a series of changes Abigail had learned over these weeks to read, like weather confusion, then recognition, then something that settled into a stillness far more frightening than anger would have been. "This is my father's hand," he said finally. "I know. He cheated your father out of the river acreage." Nathaniel's voice was flat, controlled the voice of a man doing enormous work to keep something from breaking loose. "That land's some of the richest ground in the county. If your father lost it unfairly, then everything that came after the debts, the shipping venture he risked to make up for what he'd already lost, the desperation that drove my mother to Reeves, all of it might trace back to your father's dishonesty." Abigail's voice cracked on the last word. "Nathaniel, I don't know what to do with this. I don't know how to stand at an altar with you tomorrow, knowing your family may have caused my family's ruin." Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment, staring down at the letter, as though he could will the words into meaning something different than what they plainly meant. "I didn't know," he said finally. "I want you to hear that clearly, Abigail, because I understand exactly how convenient it sounds coming from me now. I did not know my father did this. I was 14 years old when this letter was written. I inherited land, and I inherited debts, and I inherited a great many things about my father's character that I've spent years trying not to examine too closely, because he was cruel to my mother and cold to me, and I told myself none of that made him dishonest, only difficult. I was wrong, apparently, on at least one count." "I believe you didn't know," Abigail said. "That's not what frightens me." "Then what does? That everything between us, the ballroom, the courtship, you choosing me out of 40 women, started because your family took something from mine that we never got back. What if some part of you has been trying to make amends this whole time without even knowing it? What if I'm not being chosen, Nathaniel? What if I'm being repaid?" The question hung in the air between them, ugly and honest, and Nathaniel didn't flinch from it the way Abigail half expected him to. "I understand why you'd wonder that," he said slowly. "I'd wonder it too in your position. But I'd ask you to remember something. I didn't know about this letter 3 weeks ago in that ballroom. I didn't know it the night I asked to call on you, or the day I discovered your mother's debts, or the afternoon I asked you to marry me in a stable with dirt on my hands. Whatever's between us, Abigail, it was built before either of us knew anything about a river survey signed 11 years ago. This letter doesn't explain why I chose you. It only explains something ugly about my father that I now have to decide what to do with." "And what will you do with it?" "I'll make it right," he said without a second's hesitation. "The land will be returned, or its value paid in full, with whatever interest a court would find fair, regardless of what happens between us tomorrow. That was never in question the moment I read this letter. Your family is owed a debt older and larger than anything Silas Reeves ever tried to collect, and I intend to settle it." Abigail looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for the calculation she'd learned to expect from every person who'd ever wanted something from her family, and found instead only a plain and uncomfortable honesty. "I still need to think," she said, "about tomorrow." "Take the day," Nathaniel said quietly. "I'll understand whatever you decide." She spent the day walking the river frontage alone, the same acreage named in the letter, rich green land, running down to water, that caught the afternoon light in a way that made it easy to understand why two families might have fought over it for a generation. She thought about her father, a quiet man who'd never once spoken of losing ground to the Carters, who'd instead thrown himself into a risky shipping venture that ultimately killed him with worry before it killed the family financially. Had he known? Had he suspected the survey was rigged and simply lacked the money or the will to contest it? Or had he genuinely believed until his dying day that he'd lost that land fair and square? Never knowing the truth, his daughter now held in her hands. She thought about Nathaniel, 14 years old, when the letter was written, a boy who couldn't have stopped his father's dishonesty, even if he'd somehow known about it, growing into a man who'd walked past 40 eligible women to choose the daughter of a family his own father had wronged without any knowledge that he was doing so. "It doesn't explain why I chose you," he'd said. "It only explains something ugly about my father." She wanted to believe that. She realized, standing on land that should have belonged to her family for another generation, that she did believe it, Not because it was convenient, but because every single thing she'd learned about Nathaniel Carter in these past weeks contradicted the cold calculation the letter suggested. He'd found the debt without being asked. He'd offered to pay it before Reeves had even made his final demand. He'd knelt in effect in a stable full of dirt and horses, and asked for her hand with nothing to gain, and everything: reputation, family alliance, an easier life with an heiress to lose. A man capable of that kind of honesty didn't need his father's guilt to explain his choices. She turned back toward the house as the sun began to lower. Her mind settled in a way it hadn't been since Mrs. Brooks first set that wooden box on her bed and found Margaret waiting for her on the porch, an expression on her face that Abigail hadn't seen there in years. "Mrs. Brooks told me what she found," Margaret said quietly. "About the letter." "I know. Your father knew," Margaret said, and the admission seemed to cost her something enormous. "Not everything, not the specifics you've read, but he suspected the survey was unfair. He told me once years ago that Josiah Carter had cheated him out of the Riverland, and there was nothing to be done about it. Not with the money we had, not against a family with Carter's resources. He made me promise never to speak of it. He said it would only breed bitterness, and bitterness never put food on a table." Margaret's eyes were wet, unfamiliar with the vulnerability of the moment. "I think in his own quiet way he was ashamed. Not of losing the land, of not being able to fight for it." Abigail felt something in her chest crack open. Grief for a father who'd carried a private wound for over a decade and never once let his daughters see the weight of it. "Why didn't you tell me any of this before?" she asked. "Because I didn't know how to tell you, without also telling you how frightened I've been every day since he died," Margaret said. "Frightened of losing everything. Frightened of failing you and Charlotte both. I made terrible choices out of that fear, Abigail, the letters to Reeves, the secrecy, all of it. I'm not asking you to forgive it. I'm only asking you to understand that fear does terrible things to a person's judgment, and I hope whatever you decide about tomorrow, that you never have to learn that lesson the way I did." It wasn't quite an apology, but it was perhaps the most honest thing Margaret Harper had said to her daughter in 6 years, and Abigail found she had no interest in punishing honesty when it finally arrived. "I'm marrying him tomorrow," she said. Margaret's face went through several expressions before settling on something like relief. "You're certain?" "I'm certain that whatever his father did, Nathaniel didn't do it. I'm certain a man doesn't spend 3 weeks uncovering a stranger's debts and offering to settle them out of guilt he doesn't even know he's carrying. And I'm certain," Abigail said, her voice steadying with each word, "that I would rather build a life with an honest man who inherited a dishonest father than spend the rest of mine punishing him for a crime he didn't commit." The wedding day arrived bright and warm, the kind of clear August morning that felt to Abigail like the whole county had conspired to offer her good weather as a small apology for everything that had come before. The church filled early. Word of the courtship, its speed, its strangeness. The whispered rumors about debts and Charleston relatives and a man who'd walked past 40 women to choose the family's forgotten daughter had traveled through 3 counties in a month, and half of Virginia society seemed to have found a reason to attend, whether from genuine goodwill or simple curiosity about how the whole spectacle would resolve. Abigail stood in the small side room behind the church, Charlotte fussing with her veil, Margaret hovering nearby, with an expression somewhere between pride and lingering guilt, when Mrs. Brooks appeared in the doorway, her face tight with an urgency that cut straight through the room's fragile calm. "There's a man asking for Mr. Carter," she said. "Says his name is Cornelius Carter. Says he's Nathaniel's uncle, and he's brought a lawyer with him." Abigail's stomach dropped. "Nathaniel's never mentioned an uncle." "I don't believe they're close," Mrs. Brooks said carefully. "But he's here now, and he's asking to speak with the wedding party before the ceremony begins. He didn't look like a man come to offer congratulations, if you'll forgive my saying so." Nathaniel arrived at the side room moments later, already dressed for the ceremony. His face carrying the particular stillness Abigail had learned meant he was working hard to control something enormous. "My uncle's here," he confirmed before Abigail could ask. "I haven't seen him in 3 years. We don't correspond." My father's will left him as trustee over a portion of the estate until I turned 30, a provision meant to protect the land during my minority. Except I turned 30 2 years ago, and Cornelius has spent every year since finding reasons to delay releasing full control. What does he want today of all days? I don't know, but I intend to find out before this wedding proceeds one step further, because if he's come to make trouble, I'd rather it happen here privately than in front of 300 guests in that church. They found Cornelius Carter, waiting in the small vestibule, outside a heavy-set man in an expensive coat, with a thin, nervous lawyer standing at his elbow clutching a leather folio like it might escape him. Cornelius's eyes moved over Abigail with an assessment so blatant, so openly dismissive, that she felt her spine straighten on instinct. "So this is her," he said without preamble. "The Harper girl. Say what you've come to say, Cornelius." Nathaniel set his voice flat. "You've got until the organ starts. I've come to inform you that this marriage cannot proceed as planned." Cornelius's smile was thin, satisfied, the smile of a man who believed he was holding every card. "Your father's will contains a provision you seem to have forgotten. Nephew Article 12, requiring family council approval for any marriage entered into, while I retain trusteeship over the Eastern holdings. I have not approved this marriage. I do not intend to." The lawyer stepped forward, producing a document from his folio with the careful, practiced motion of a man who'd rehearsed this moment. "The clause is quite clear, Mr. Carter. Should you proceed without council approval, the eastern acreage, some 2,000 acres including the primary tobacco fields, reverts to your uncle's sole trusteeship for a period of no less than 10 years. Abigail felt the room tilt. 2,000 acres. Nathaniel, is that? "It's the bulk of the working land," Nathaniel said grimly, not taking his eyes off his uncle. "Cornelius has been waiting 3 years for a reason to invoke that clause, because it would hand him control of nearly everything my father built, and he knows I've never married, never given him the opening he needed. Until now. You could simply wait," Cornelius said, almost pleasant now, the pleasantness of a man twisting the knife slowly because he could afford to enjoy it. "Delay the wedding. Seek council approval properly through the process my brother laid out for exactly this reason, to protect the family's holdings from hasty decisions. I'd imagine the council would take a year, perhaps 2, given how thoroughly these matters require review." His eyes cut to Abigail again, cold and assessing. Plenty of time for a man to reconsider whether a penniless bride is truly worth 2,000 acres of prime tobacco land. "You want me to abandon her?" Nathaniel said, "so you can keep control of land that isn't yours." "I want you to make a rational decision, nephew, rather than a romantic one. There's no shame in it. Men marry for practical reasons every day. This one simply requires you to wait." Cornelius smiled again, and this time there was nothing pleasant in it at all. "Or marry her today and hand me the eastern fields for a decade. Your choice entirely." Abigail stood very still, watching Nathaniel's jaw work, watching the calculation move behind his eyes, and felt something cold and familiar settle over her, the sensation of being once again a bargaining chip in someone else's negotiation, her own worth measured against acreage and tobacco yields by men who'd never once asked what she wanted. "I won't ask you to give up your land for me," she said quietly before Nathaniel could answer. "Not after everything it's taken to get here." Nathaniel turned to look at her, something fierce moving across his face. "You think I'd choose land over you?" "I think it's 2,000 acres, Nathaniel. I think it's everything your father built, everything you've spent your life protecting. I won't be the reason you lose it, Abigail." He took her hands, ignoring his uncle entirely, now ignoring the lawyer's nervous shuffling, ignoring the organ music that had just begun faintly through the church walls. "Listen to me. I have spent 3 years managing that man's petty delays, his constant interference, his endless search for leverage. I know exactly what he is. And I am telling you plainly that I would rather work every one of those 2,000 acres myself with my bare hands than spend one more day wondering whether I chose land over you." "That's easy to say standing here," Cornelius interjected. Considerably harder to live with once the harvest comes in short and the bank calls in your notes. Get out of my way, Cornelius. I don't think you understand the position you're in. I understand it perfectly. Nathaniel's voice dropped into something low and dangerous, the voice Abigail had heard only once before the day he'd found the mark on her cheek. I understand that you've spent 3 years trying to find a way to steal my father's land out from under me, and you finally found a clause obscure enough to attempt it in front of 300 witnesses on my wedding day, believing I'd be too frightened of the loss to call your bluff. He stepped closer, and Cornelius, for all his bluster, took an involuntary step back. So let me offer you a different calculation, Uncle. If you invoke that clause today, I will spend every dollar I have left contesting it in court, and I will make certain the entire county hears exactly why you've spent 3 years refusing to release a trusteeship that legally expired the day I turned 30. I imagine that story will interest quite a few people out there in that church. Something flickered across Cornelius's face, the first genuine uncertainty Abigail had seen there. You wouldn't dare drag family matters into public court. Watch me. Nathaniel's eyes didn't waver. I've spent 3 years being patient with you because I didn't want to embarrass my father's memory with a public dispute over his brother's greed. That patience ends today. Invoke the clause, and I promise you every judge in this state will hear exactly how you've delayed releasing funds that were never legally yours to hold this long in the first place. The lawyer Abigail noticed had gone very quiet, very pale, shuffling the papers in his folio, like a man who suddenly wished to be anywhere else. Cornelius's mouth worked for a moment before any sound came out. You're bluffing. Try me. The two men stared at each other for a long, taut silence, and Abigail found she was holding her breath, watching a negotiation play out that would determine not just her own future, but the shape of the family she was about to marry into. It was the lawyer who broke first. Mr. Carter, he said quietly to Cornelius, if this goes to public court, the trusteeship records will be examined in full, all of them, including the disbursements from the last 3 years. He didn't elaborate further. He didn't need to. Whatever those disbursements contained, the color that drained from Cornelius Carter's face told Abigail everything she needed to know. This isn't finished, Cornelius said, but the fight had gone out of his voice, replaced by something considerably more careful. It is actually, Nathaniel said. You're going to walk out that door, and you're going to sign the release of trusteeship before the week is out, and in exchange, I'll refrain from making the last 3 years of Eastern Holdings disbursements a matter of public record. That's the only negotiation happening today, Uncle. Take it or don't, but either way, I'm marrying this woman in 20 minutes. Cornelius looked between his lawyer and his nephew, calculating something Abigail couldn't fully read, and then, with the stiff, furious dignity of a man who'd just lost a battle, he'd believed unlosable, turned and walked out of the vestibule without another word. The lawyer scrambled after him, folio clutched tight, and the door swung shut behind them with a finality that seemed to release all the air Abigail had been holding in her chest. You knew about the disbursements, she said, whatever they are. I've suspected for 2 years he's been skimming from the trust accounts he was supposed to be managing on my behalf. I've never had proof enough to act on it until today, apparently when his lawyer just confirmed it for free. Something almost like a smile touched Nathaniel's mouth, tired and relieved all at once. I suppose I owe him a small debt of gratitude for that, though I doubt he'd appreciate hearing it. Abigail let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for a full quarter hour. Is it over, truly? It's over. He reached up gently and adjusted a piece of her veil that had come loose in the tension of the last 10 minutes, his hands steady, even though Abigail could feel faintly that they were not entirely without a tremor of their own. Now, if you're still willing, I believe there's a church full of people out there waiting for us, after all that. Abigail said something almost like laughter bubbling up beneath the residual fear. You still have to ask if I'm willing. I intend to keep asking. Nathaniel said, for as long as we both live. I'd rather you married me because you chose to every single day than because you felt there was nothing left to choose. The ceremony itself passed in a blur that Abigail would only fully reconstruct in memory. Days later, the walk down the aisle passed 300 faces, some kind, some merely curious, some openly skeptical. Her mother's hand gripping hers for one brief moment before releasing her to Nathaniel at the front of the church. Charlotte's face bright with something that looked finally like unguarded happiness for someone else. Nathaniel's voice steady and certain, saying words he clearly meant with his whole chest, without a trace of the calculation the county had spent years attributing to him. Her own voice, saying them back steadier than she'd expected, steady enough that she caught from the corner of her eye her mother pressing a handkerchief to her face. And then, astonishingly, it was done. Married. The two of them turning to face a church full of witnesses, to a courtship that had begun with a dance no one expected, and nearly ended twice now, under the weight of debts and dishonesty that had nothing to do with either of them, and everything to do with the families they'd been born into. The reception that followed was held in the Carter house's largest room tables, laden with more food than Abigail had seen in one place in years, and for a while, a blessed uncomplicated, while it felt simply like a celebration, like the kind of joy she'd never let herself expect might one day belong to her. It didn't last. She was standing near the edge of the room, catching her breath from an hour of receiving well wishes from strangers, when she noticed a woman watching her from across the crowd. Tall, elegant, dressed in a shade of blue, too rich to be anything but expensive, her expression carrying none of the polite warmth the rest of the guests had at least performed. "That's Victoria Ashford," Charlotte murmured, appearing at Abigail's elbow with a plate of cake she'd clearly been enjoying more than the social obligations around her. "Everyone expected Nathaniel to marry her before you. Her family's owned the neighboring plantation for 3 generations. She's been out of the county for a year visiting relatives in Richmond, or so the story goes. And now she's back." "Now she's back," Charlotte agreed, watching the woman with obvious wariness. "On the exact day you married the man everyone always assumed she would." Victoria approached them with the unhurried confidence of a woman who'd never once in her life doubted she belonged wherever she chose to walk, and offered Abigail a smile that didn't extend anywhere near her eyes. "Mrs. Carter," she said, testing the name like it tasted strange in her mouth. "How very sudden all this has been. I've only just returned from Richmond and found the whole county talking of nothing else. Miss Ashford, I presume." "You presume correctly." Victoria's gaze moved over Abigail with the same assessing coldness Cornelius had shown that morning, though considerably better disguised beneath social pleasantry. "I confess I'm curious. Nathaniel and I have known each other since childhood. Our families have discussed a match between us for years, practically an understanding really, if not a formal engagement. I wonder what changed his mind so quickly, and so completely, in favor of a woman he'd apparently never spoken 2 words to before this summer. Perhaps he simply preferred honesty to an arrangement," Abigail said evenly. However many years it had been discussed. Something flashed across Victoria's face. Surprise, perhaps, that the quiet, forgotten Harper girl had a spine after all. "How direct of you." "I've found directness serves better than pretending not to notice when someone's trying to unsettle me, Miss Ashford." Victoria's smile sharpened, and for one moment the careful social mask slipped just enough to show something colder underneath. "I imagine you'll need that directness, Mrs. Carter, given what's coming. You should know Nathaniel's temper isn't the patient thing it appears in courtship, and his family has a long history of choosing convenience over constancy. Ask his uncle if you doubt me. Ask what happened to the last woman his father promised land to and then quietly abandoned once the arrangement grew inconvenient." Abigail went very still. "What are you talking about? Ask your husband," Victoria said, already turning to leave, already gliding back into the crowd with the satisfied air of a woman who'd planted a seed she fully expected to bloom into something ugly. "I'm certain he'll have an explanation ready. He usually does." Abigail found Nathaniel an hour later in a quiet corner near the garden doors, and repeated Victoria's words plainly, watching his face for whatever truth or lie might surface there. Nathaniel's expression when she finished wasn't guilt. It was something closer to weary recognition, There's no hidden woman, Abigail, if that's what she was implying. Victoria's angry and hurt, likely embarrassed in front of half the county, to learn I'd married someone else. While she was away visiting relatives, she probably hoped would distract her from waiting on an understanding I never actually agreed to. She's saying whatever she believes will unsettle you most. She mentioned your father. Land promised to a woman then withdrawn. Something shifted briefly in Nathaniel's face. That's an old story. Before my mother. My father was engaged once in his youth to a woman whose family owned land bordering ours. The engagement ended badly. I don't know all the details. I was a child when it happened, and my father never spoke of it. Whatever Victoria's implying by bringing it up today, I promise you it has nothing to do with us. Abigail studied him, weighing the plain, tired honesty in his face against the careful malice she'd seen in Victoria's smile. I believe you, she said finally. But I want you to understand something, Nathaniel. Today alone I faced your uncle trying to steal your land, and a woman who clearly still wants to be standing where I'm standing, both of them testing whether I'd crumble under the weight of it. I didn't marry you today to spend the rest of my life fending off every person in this county who believes they had a better claim to your attention than I did. You won't have to fend them off alone, Nathaniel said. Not anymore. He took her hand steady, certain the same grip that had led her onto a ballroom floor a month earlier and changed the entire shape of her life. Whatever comes, Cornelius, Victoria, whoever else decides to test what we've built today, we face it together. That's the whole of the vow I made an hour ago. Abigail and I intend to keep it. Across the room, Margaret watched her daughter and new son-in-law with an expression Abigail had never seen on her mother's face before. Something unguarded. Something that looked for the first time in 6 long years, entirely like pride, without calculation attached to it. The music started again, slow and formal. The same reel that had played the night everything began, and Nathaniel extended his hand toward Abigail exactly as he had that first night, palm up, patient, certain. Dance with me, he said. Properly this time. No ballroom full of strangers deciding what it means. Abigail set her hand in his and let him lead her onto the floor, and for one long, unguarded moment allowed herself to simply exist inside the astonishing fact of it. Not the forgotten daughter anymore, not a debt to be settled or a bargaining chip to be moved, but a woman who had against every expectation the county had ever held for her chosen, and been chosen in return. Married life did not, as it turned out, arrive with the quiet Abigail had privately hoped for. Within a week of the wedding, word reached the Carter house that Cornelius had not signed the release of trusteeship as promised. Instead, he'd retained a second lawyer, one considerably more aggressive than the nervous man who'd accompanied him to the wedding, and filed a formal petition with the county court, disputing the validity of Nathaniel's marriage entirely on the grounds that Article 12 required not merely notification, but documented council approval, and no such document existed. He's trying to have the marriage declared improper, Nathaniel said, reading the court notice at the breakfast table with a stillness that Abigail had learned in 1 short week of marriage, meant he was furious in the particular controlled way that frightened people more than shouting ever could. Not to void it outright. He knows he can't manage that, but to tie it up in dispute long enough that he can argue the eastern acreage should remain under his trusteeship until the matter's settled. Can he do that? He can try. Whether he succeeds depends on how sympathetic a judge he finds and how much money he's willing to spend proving a point that will cost him more in legal fees than the land is worth to argue over. Nathaniel set the notice down, jaw tight. This isn't about the land anymore, not really. It's about making certain I understand he's not finished simply because I called his bluff at the wedding. Abigail reached across the table and took his hand. Then we don't let him rattle us. Easier said. Perhaps. But I've spent 6 years being told what I was worth by people who had no right to decide it, Nathaniel. I don't intend to spend my marriage the same way, and neither should you. She squeezed his hand once firm. Let him file his petitions. Let him spend his money on lawyers. We'll meet him in whatever room he chooses to fight in, and we'll win, because we have the truth, and he has nothing but greed dressed up as principle. Something in Nathaniel's face eased just slightly at the certainty in her voice. You've become considerably more fierce since the wedding, Mrs. Carter. "I've always been fierce," Abigail said. "I simply didn't have anyone worth being fierce for before." The court hearing was set for the last week of August, and in the days leading up to it, the whole county seemed to split into camps, those who thought Cornelius Carter a greedy old man trying to steal from his own nephew, and those considerably fewer but louder, who whispered that perhaps there was something to his claims after all, that perhaps a marriage entered into so quickly under such strange circumstances deserved a closer look. Victoria Ashford. Abigail noticed, seemed to have found her voice among the second camp. She's been at 3 separate teas this week. Charlotte reported arriving at the Carter house with the particular breathless energy of a younger sister who considered gossip a sacred duty. Telling anyone who'll listen that the marriage was rushed to avoid proper scrutiny, that Mr. Carter's uncle simply wants what any reasonable family member would want, time to be certain the match is sound. She's very careful never to say anything outright unkind, just enough doubt to make people wonder. "She's doing Cornelius's work for him," Nathaniel said grimly when Abigail relayed the news that evening. "Softening public opinion before the hearing, so if the judge rules in his favor, it won't look like a greedy old man stealing land from his nephew. It'll look like a cautious family protecting itself from a hasty marriage. Can we stop it? Not by arguing with her directly. That only feeds the story." Nathaniel rubbed a hand across his jaw, thinking. The only thing that stops rumor is truth loud enough to drown it out. Which means the hearing needs to go well publicly decisively, not just a quiet ruling filed away in some clerk's office, but something the whole county sees clearly enough that Victoria's tea-time insinuations look foolish by comparison. Abigail thought of her father's old advice watch, first speak second, and found herself for the first time wanting to do considerably more than watch. "Let me help," she said. "Abigail." "I mean it, Nathaniel. This isn't only your fight, it's mine too. My marriage being questioned, my family's reputation dragged through this alongside yours. I want to help build the case, not simply wait at home for news of how it went." Nathaniel studied her for a long moment, and whatever he saw in her face seemed to settle something in him. "All right," he said. "Then let's start with what we actually know about Cornelius's disbursements. If we can prove he's been mismanaging the trust, not just delayed the release, but actively taken from it, that changes the entire shape of this hearing." The work that followed consumed the better part of 2 weeks-long evenings at the dining table, with ledgers spread between them. Nathaniel's memory of old transactions cross-referenced against Abigail's careful, methodical eye for numbers that didn't add up, a skill she'd honed unknowingly over 6 years of watching her mother's household accounts shrink and shift without explanation. "Here," Abigail said one evening, tapping a line in an old ledger Nathaniel had retrieved from his father's study. "This disbursement 3 years back. $4,000 marked as estate maintenance and improvement. But look at the timing, it's dated the same month Cornelius purchased his new carriage, the one everyone in the county remarked on." Nathaniel leaned over her shoulder, studying the entry. "That's not proof of anything on its own." "No, but it's a thread." Abigail turned the page, found another entry, and another, laying them side by side. "Look at the pattern. Every disbursement marked maintenance or improvement happens within weeks of some visible expense. On Cornelius's part, the carriage, the renovation to his own house last spring, a trip to Richmond he took in the winter that everyone assumed was for business. If we can find receipts, invoices, anything that shows the eastern acreage never actually received the improvements these disbursements claim to fund, then we prove he's been stealing from the trust for years." Nathaniel finished, something sharpening in his eyes. "Not merely delaying its release out of caution, actively taking from it." Exactly. It took another week of careful work letters to tenant farmers on the eastern acreage, asking plainly whether any of the claimed improvements had actually occurred. Quiet visits to merchants in town who might have supplied materials for work that was never done. Careful accounting of every dollar Cornelius had claimed to spend against what could actually be verified as spent. By the time they finished, they had a case considerably stronger than anything Nathaniel had managed to assemble alone in 3 years of suspicion. "You did this," Nathaniel said, looking over the final assembled evidence spread across the table, genuine astonishment in his voice. In 2 weeks, you built a case I couldn't manage in 3 years. You were too close to it, Abigail said. Too much history, too much old anger clouding what you could see clearly. I came to it fresh. That's all. That's not all. He reached over, tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his hand lingering against her cheek in a way that had become, in these short weeks, achingly familiar. You're remarkable, Abigail Carter. I hope you know that. I'm learning to believe it, she admitted. Slowly. The hearing itself was held in the county courthouse, a building considerably too small for the crowd that gathered outside it, word having spread through 3 counties that the Carter family dispute was finally coming to a public reckoning. Cornelius arrived first, flanked by his aggressive new lawyer. His chin lifted with the particular confidence of a man who still believed, despite everything, that he held the stronger hand. Victoria Ashford. Abigail noticed had found a seat near the front of the gallery, positioned where her reactions would be visible to as many people as possible. The judge, an elderly man named Whitmore, known through the county for a patience that bordered on tedium and a memory for detail that made him nearly impossible to deceive, called the proceedings to order with a weary efficiency that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. Cornelius's lawyer spoke first, laying out the argument they'd all expected: Article 12, the requirement for documented counsel approval. The marriage's questionable haste, the suggestion delivered with careful legal delicacy that a young woman of limited means marrying a wealthy man within a single month deserved at minimum the scrutiny the family provision was designed to provide. Abigail felt the words land like small stones, each one aimed carefully at the same old wound. Limited means questionable haste deserved scrutiny. The same judgments she'd absorbed her whole life in quieter, crueler forms. She kept her spine straight and her face still exactly as her father had taught her, and waited. Nathaniel's lawyer rose next and methodically, patiently laid out everything Abigail had helped assemble: the ledgers, the mismatched disbursements, the tenant testimonies, confirming no improvements had ever been made to the eastern acreage, despite years of claimed maintenance expenses, the merchant records showing no materials had ever been purchased for the work Cornelius insisted had been done. Your Honor, the lawyer concluded, my client's uncle has spent 3 years refusing to release a trusteeship that legally expired when Mr. Carter turned 30, and the evidence presented today suggests a clear and troubling reason why not caution, not family protection, but the ongoing concealment of funds diverted from the estate for personal use. We would respectfully suggest that any provision requiring counsel approval for marriage was intended to protect the estate from genuine harm, not to provide cover for a trustee unwilling to relinquish control of funds he has been quietly misappropriating. The courtroom went very still. Judge Whitmore studied the evidence laid before him for a long, silent moment, flipping through ledger pages and tenant statements, with the unhurried care of a man who understood exactly how much weight his next words would carry. Mr. Carter, he said, finally addressing Cornelius directly, can you account for the $4,000 disbursement recorded here dated 3 years past, marked for estate improvements that the tenant testimony before me suggests were never made? Cornelius's composure, so carefully maintained through the earlier arguments, cracked visibly for the first time. Your Honor, the improvements were planned, delayed by weather, by labor shortages. For 3 years, Cornelius glanced at his lawyer, who offered nothing but a tight, uncomfortable silence in return. I would need to review my own records more carefully before. You've had 3 years to review your own records, Mr. Carter, Whitmore said, not unkindly, but with a finality that carried its own quiet weight. I find the evidence presented today considerably more compelling than the objection raised regarding the marriage. This court sees no legal basis to void or delay a marriage validly entered into by 2 consenting adults, and finds further that the trusteeship over the eastern acreage should have terminated as originally specified upon Mr. Nathaniel Carter's 30th birthday. I am ordering the immediate and full release of trusteeship effective today, along with a formal audit of all disbursements made during the extended period to determine what, if anything, is owed back to the estate. Yea. The gallery erupted into a low murmur of conversation. and Abigail felt Nathaniel's hand find hers under the table, gripping tight. "It's over," he murmured. Truly over this time. Cornelius did not look at either of them as he gathered his papers and left the courtroom, his face carrying an expression Abigail could only describe as a man watching every carefully constructed plan collapse at once, with nothing left to salvage from the wreckage. Victoria Ashford in the gallery did not look pleased either. The victory should have felt complete. For a few days it nearly did the whole county buzzing now, not with questions about the marriage's propriety, but with astonished gossip about Cornelius Carter's mismanaged trusteeship, the story shifting exactly as Nathaniel had hoped, from doubt about Abigail to scandal about his uncle. But peace Abigail was learning rarely arrived without something else waiting behind it. It was Mrs. Brooks again who brought the next trouble to her door, though this time the housekeeper's face carried an urgency that went beyond old letters and family secrets. "There's a fire," she said, breathless, having run the distance from the kitchen. "At your mother's house. One of the field hands rode over to tell us started in the kitchen, spread fast. They're saying your mother and sister are safe, got out in time, but the house—" Abigail didn't wait to hear the rest. She was already moving, already calling for Nathaniel, already feeling the cold, familiar dread of watching everything shift beneath her feet without warning. They arrived to find the Harper house, half-consumed smoke, still curling from what remained of the roofline, Margaret standing in the yard, wrapped in a borrowed shawl, with an expression of such total devastation that Abigail felt her own chest tighten just looking at her. "Mother?" Abigail ran to her, checking her over with frantic hands. "Are you hurt, Charlotte?" "We're both unharmed," Margaret said, her voice hollow, staring past Abigail at the smoking ruin of the only home she'd ever known as a wife and mother. The kitchen fire spread to the pantry, then up through the walls before anyone could stop it. We managed to save some of the furniture, a few trunks. The rest— Her voice broke entirely. "The rest is gone, Abigail. Everything. Your father's letters, his portrait, the good china that was your grandmother's." Charlotte appeared at Margaret's side, soot-streaked and shaking, and Abigail pulled her sister into an embrace that neither of them seemed willing to break. "You'll come stay with us," Nathaniel said, arriving at Abigail's side, already surveying the wreckage with the practical eye of a man calculating what needed doing next, rather than dwelling on what was lost. "Both of you. There's more than enough room at the house, and we'll begin arrangements to rebuild as soon as the damage is fully assessed." Margaret looked at him, something raw and grateful crossing her face. "You'd do that? After everything You're my wife's mother," Nathaniel said simply. "And whatever's passed between us, I don't intend to let you and Charlotte sleep in a barn while I have rooms standing empty. We'll discuss the rest later when you're not standing in front of a burning house." It was, Abigail thought, watching him direct the field hands toward salvaging what furniture could still be saved. Exactly the kind of quiet, unglamorous decency that the whole county had never once credited him with. Too distracted by his coldness in ballrooms to notice the steadiness underneath it. The fire, as it turned out, was not the accident it first appeared to be. It was one of the Harper field hands, a young man named Tobias, who'd worked the property since boyhood, who came forward 3 days later, hat in hand, clearly terrified to speak with Nathaniel privately. "I saw something, sir," he said, his voice low, glancing over his shoulder, as though he expected to be overheard, even in the empty stable where Nathaniel had taken him to talk. "The night of the fire. A man near the kitchen door, not long before the smoke started. I didn't think much of it at the time, figured he was passing through, maybe lost his way. But then the fire started, not 20 minutes later, right where I'd seen him standing." "Can you describe him?" "Tall, well-dressed, better than most folk who'd have reason to be walking that road at night. I didn't see his face clear, but—" Tobias hesitated. "He was getting into a carriage when I lost sight of him. A fine one. Not the kind a common traveler would own." Nathaniel's face went very still. "Cornelius." "I can't say for certain, sir. I wouldn't want to accuse a man wrongly." "You're not accusing anyone, Tobias. You're telling me what you saw. That's all I'm asking of you." Nathaniel pressed a few coins into the young man's hand, more from instinct than any real belief the boy needed convincing to keep speaking honestly. If anyone asks what you saw, you tell them the same thing you told me. Nothing more, nothing less. Abigail, when she heard the account later that evening, felt something cold and furious settle low in her stomach. He burned my mother's house. After losing everything at the hearing, after being humiliated in front of the whole county, he burned it out of spite. We don't know that for certain, Nathaniel said, though the grim set of his jaw suggested he believed it every bit as much as she did. A tall, well-dressed man in a fine carriage could describe half a dozen men in this county. How many of them have a reason to want my family ruined? Nathaniel didn't answer, because they both already knew there was only one. Proving it, however, was another matter entirely, and the days that followed brought a frustration Abigail hadn't anticipated. Cornelius, when questioned discreetly by Nathaniel's lawyer, produced an alibi accounting for his whereabouts. The night of the fire, a dinner engagement with a business associate 2 counties over, witnessed by no fewer than 6 people willing to swear to his presence. It's too convenient, Nathaniel said, pacing the length of the study late one evening, the ledgers from the trusteeship case still scattered across his desk from weeks of preparation that now felt, in the face of this new suspicion, entirely insufficient. 6 witnesses, all conveniently available, all willing to swear to the exact same account without hesitation. That's not the alibi of an innocent man. That's the alibi of a man who paid for one. But we can't prove that either. No, Nathaniel admitted. Not yet. Abigail sat across from him, watching the frustration work through his shoulders, and felt something shift in her own thinking, a realization that had been building slowly since the hearing, since the fire, since watching Cornelius's carefully constructed alibi close around him like a door she couldn't quite force open. Perhaps we're going about this wrong, she said slowly. How do you mean? We keep trying to prove what he did directly: the fire, the disbursements, all of it built on evidence he's clever enough to obscure or explain away. What if instead we made it impossible for him to benefit from any of it, regardless of what we can or can't prove? Nathaniel stopped pacing. Go on. The audit ordered at the hearing. It's already underway, isn't it? Reviewing every disbursement from the trusteeship years. It is. Then let it run its full course publicly, with every finding reported to the court as required. Don't chase the fire separately. Let the financial ruin speak for itself. A man who's exposed as having stolen from his own nephew's trust for years, who's then also suspected, even without proof, of burning down his nephew's mother-in-law's house out of spite, becomes a man no one in this county will do business with, extend credit to, or associate with ever again. You don't need a court to convict him of arson if the whole of Virginia society convicts him of being exactly the kind of man capable of it. Nathaniel studied her for a long moment, something like admiration mixing with the residual anger in his expression. You have a considerably sharper mind for strategy than most men I've done business with, Mrs. Carter. I've spent 6 years learning to survive people who underestimated me, Abigail said. It turns out that skill is useful for considerably more than surviving a cruel stepmother. The audit, when it finally concluded 3 weeks later, confirmed everything the initial evidence had suggested, and considerably more, nearly $9,000, diverted from the Eastern trusteeship over 3 years, disguised behind falsified maintenance records and improvements that existed nowhere but on paper. The court ordered full restitution with interest, and the story, exactly as Abigail had predicted, spread through the county with a speed and thoroughness that made any lingering doubt about the fire almost unnecessary. Cornelius Carter did not remain in the county long after the ruling. Whether from shame, financial ruin, or simple recognition that his welcome had entirely expired, he sold what remained of his own holdings within the month and departed for parts unknown, leaving behind a reputation so thoroughly destroyed that even Victoria Ashford, when she encountered Abigail at a church gathering not long after, offered something that might charitably have been called an apology. I judged you too quickly, Victoria said, stiff and clearly uncomfortable with the admission. I let my own disappointment color what I was willing to believe about you. That wasn't fair, and I regret the things I said at your wedding. Thank you for saying so, Abigail said, and meant it, though she made no move to pretend the two of them would ever be close friends. Some wounds healed into scars rather than disappearing entirely, and Abigail had learned enough in her short marriage to know the difference between forgiveness and forgetting. The rebuilding of the Harper house began that autumn, funded in full by Nathaniel, not as charity, he insisted firmly, but as restitution owed for the river acreage his father had taken unfairly over a decade before, a debt he'd promised to settle, regardless of what happened between him and Abigail, and one he intended to honor in full, now that the chaos of the trusteeship battle had finally cleared. Margaret, watching the new foundation being laid where the old kitchen had stood, found Abigail one afternoon standing at the edge of the construction and settled beside her with the particular carefulness of a woman still learning how to occupy space beside her daughter without old habits of control creeping back in. "I don't know how to thank you," Margaret said. "Either of you, for any of it. You don't need to thank us, Mother. Nathaniel's settling a debt his family owed yours. That's simply justice, not generosity. Perhaps. But I know generosity when I see it too, whatever name you put on it." Margaret watched the workman for a long moment, her hands folded carefully in her lap. "I've been thinking these past weeks about everything I did wrong. The letters to Reeves, the years I spent treating you like a burden instead of a daughter. I don't have a good excuse for any of it, Abigail. Only fear, and fear isn't an excuse, not really. It's just an explanation." "I know," Abigail said quietly. "I've been thinking about it too. About whether I can forgive you fully, or whether some part of this will always sit between us. And I think," Abigail said slowly, watching the new frame of the house take shape against the autumn sky, "that forgiveness doesn't have to arrive all at once. I think it can be something we build the same way they're building that house, slowly, one piece at a time, with the understanding that some of what burned isn't coming back exactly as it was, but something new can still stand where the old thing used to be. Something sturdier maybe for having been tested." Margaret's eyes filled, and for once she didn't try to hide it. "I'd like that, if you're willing." "I'm willing," Abigail said, and reached over to take her mother's hand, the gesture no longer strange or performed, but something real, something earned through months of crisis that had in their own painful way rebuilt more than a single house. That evening, walking the fence line with Nathaniel in the fading autumn light, the same fence line where he'd first told her about her mother's debts, where he'd first asked her to trust him with the truth, Abigail felt something settle in her chest that she hadn't fully expected to feel this soon. Into a marriage that had begun so strangely under such improbable circumstances. Peace. Not the absence of trouble. Trouble, she suspected, would always find its way to a family with land and money and history enough to attract it. But the steady, hard-won confidence that whatever came next, she would not face it, as she'd faced every difficulty before this summer alone, invisible, expected to absorb whatever blow landed without complaint. "You're quiet," Nathaniel said, echoing without realizing it the same words he'd said to her weeks ago on this same path. "I'm thinking," Abigail said, "about how much has changed since the night you walked past 40 women to ask me to dance." "Regrets? None." She stopped walking, turned to face him fully, the last of the sunlight catching gold in his hair. "I spent 6 years being told I was the forgotten daughter, the plain one, the one no one would ever choose. And then you walked past every woman in that ballroom who'd spent her whole life being groomed for exactly that moment, and you chose me instead, not because I performed for you, but because I didn't." "I'd choose you again," Nathaniel said. "Every single time, ballroom or burning house court battle or quiet evening on this fence line. There's no version of this year I'd trade for an easier one if the easier one meant not finding you." Abigail reached up, pressed her palm against his jaw, feeling the steady warmth of him beneath her hand, the same steadiness that had carried her through debts and lawsuits and fires, and a county full of people who doubted whether she deserved any of it. "Then let's go home," she said. "Both houses standing again, both families finally whole enough to hold what's left of the wreckage together." Nathaniel took her hand, laced his fingers through hers, and together they walked back toward the lights of the house that was now fully and completely theirs. No longer a rescue, no longer a bargain struck under the shadow of debt and desperation, but a life chosen freely built, deliberately standing solid against whatever storms might still come. The autumn gave way to winter, and with it came a season of quiet that Abigail had never dared to expect for herself, mornings spent going over the household ledgers with Nathaniel at the long table in his study, afternoons walking the rebuilt frame of her mother's house, as it slowly filled in with fresh timber, and glass evenings by the fire where conversation came easy and silence came easier still. The particular silence of two people who no longer needed words to fill every space between them. It was in the middle of that quiet in the first week of January that Abigail understood something had shifted inside her own body, and she sat on the edge of their bed for a long while before she found the courage to say it aloud. "Nathaniel." He looked up from the letter he'd been reading, something in her voice pulling him fully to attention. "What is it?" "I believe," Abigail said carefully, feeling the words settle strange and enormous in her mouth, "that I'm carrying a child." The letter slipped from his hand entirely. For a moment he only looked at her, and Abigail watched something move across his face that she had never once seen there in all the months she'd known him. Not the careful control, not the guarded stillness he wore like armor in every difficult room, but something raw and unguarded and almost frightened in its openness. "You're certain? As certain as I can be this early. Mrs. Brooks suspected before I did. She's seen enough young wives through it to know the signs before we do ourselves." Abigail felt her own eyes filling unexpected and sudden. "I didn't know how to tell you. I've been sitting with it 3 days trying to find the words." Nathaniel crossed the room and knelt in front of her, taking both her hands in his, and for a long moment he simply looked at her, wonder, plain and unhidden, on a face the whole county still believed incapable of it. "A child," he said, testing the word like it might dissolve if he said it too roughly. "Ours." "Ours," Abigail confirmed, and the tears came freely now, not from sorrow, but from something so full it had nowhere else to go. He pressed his forehead to hers, his hands trembling faintly where they held hers, and for a while neither of them said anything at all, because nothing needed saying that their held breath and joined hands didn't already say more completely. The joy, however, did not travel far before trouble found its way to their door again, as trouble always seemed to in a family with land and history enough to attract it. It arrived in the form of a letter delivered by a rider who'd come a full day's journey from Charleston, bearing a seal Abigail recognized instantly, and with a sinking dread that settled deep in her stomach the moment she saw it. Reeves. Nathaniel read it standing in the front hall, his face darkening with each line, and when he finished, he handed it to Abigail without a word, watching her reaction with the particular stillness that meant he was already 3 steps ahead in thinking through what needed doing. The letter was formal, cold, entirely without the desperate bluster Silas Reeves had shown the last time he'd descended on the county. It stated plainly that new information had come to light regarding the original shipping venture that had ruined Abigail's father, specifically evidence suggesting the venture had been fraudulent from its inception, structured deliberately to fail by men who'd profited from its collapse, and that Reeves, having only recently uncovered this fact through his own business dealings in Charleston, intended to pursue legal action against the venture's remaining organizers, one of whom the letter noted with what felt like deliberate cruelty was named as a silent partner, Cornelius Carter. "Your uncle?" Abigail said slowly, lowering the letter. "He didn't just steal from the trusteeship. He was involved in the venture that ruined my father in the first place." "It would explain a great deal," Nathaniel said grimly. "Why he was so desperate to prevent our marriage. Why he fought so hard to keep control of the eastern acreage even after his 3-year window had legally closed. If he profited from your father's ruin directly and knew that our marriage would eventually bring enough scrutiny to uncover it, then everything, the trusteeship dispute, the wedding day confrontation, possibly even the fire, all of it traces back to the same root. He's been trying to protect a secret since before either of us knew there was one to protect." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "Reeves wants something for bringing us this information. Men like him don't share evidence out of goodwill." "What does he want?" I don't know yet, but I intend to find out, because if there's a chance this proves definitively that your father's ruin was engineered rather than misfortune. That's a truth worth pursuing, regardless of what Reeves hopes to gain from delivering it. The truth, when it finally surfaced 3 weeks later through careful correspondence and a discreet visit from Nathaniel's lawyer to Charleston, proved worse than either of them had feared. The shipping venture that had claimed the bulk of the Harper family's remaining fortune had indeed been structured to fail not through incompetence, as Abigail's father had believed until his dying day, but through deliberate manipulation by 3 silent partners who'd arranged for the venture's single largest shipment to be lost at sea through bribery of the ship's captain, collecting insurance payouts that dwarfed what the honest venture could ever have earned. While the other investors, including Abigail's father, lost everything, Cornelius Carter had been one of those 3 partners. The evidence once assembled was damning beyond dispute. Correspondence payment records, even a signed confession extracted by Reeves's own lawyers from the second partner, a man now old and frightened enough of his own legal exposure to trade testimony for leniency. He killed him, Abigail said quietly, sitting across from Nathaniel with the assembled evidence spread between them, her voice flat with a grief that had waited over a year to fully surface. Not with his own hands, but he took everything my father had built, everything he'd worked for, and he did it deliberately, knowing exactly what it would cost him. My father died worrying himself into an early grave over debts that were never honestly incurred in the first place. Abigail, I need you to understand something, she continued, her voice steadying even as her eyes remained wet. I have spent this whole year learning to set aside my anger at your family, the Riverland, the trusteeship, all of it, because I believed and still believe that you had no part in any of it. But this is different. This isn't a boundary dispute or a mismanaged trust. This is a man who watched my father lose everything, who profited from his ruin, and who then spent years afterward trying to steal from you as well, all while sitting across the table from us at family gatherings, pretending at grievance instead of guilt. I know, Nathaniel said quietly. And I promise you, Abigail, I will not let this rest simply because he's already fled the county. Wherever Cornelius has gone, this evidence will follow him. He will answer for what he did to your father in whatever court will hear it, for as long as it takes. Finding Cornelius proved easier than either of them expected. He had not, as it turned out, traveled far, merely relocated to a smaller property 2 counties over, believing apparently that distance and time would be enough to let the whole affair fade from memory. He was wrong. The court summons arrived at his door within the month, backed by evidence assembled from 3 separate sources: Reeves's Charleston findings, Nathaniel's own trusteeship audit, and a growing willingness among the county's merchants and lawyers, once the full shape of Cornelius's dishonesty became clear, to come forward with whatever small pieces of the pattern they'd noticed over the years and said nothing about at the time. The trial, when it finally convened in the spring, drew a crowd even larger than the one that had gathered for the trusteeship hearing the previous summer. Abigail sat in the front row beside Nathaniel, one hand resting protectively over the small growing swell of her belly, and watched a man who had once looked at her with open contempt now sit small and diminished before a judge who had clearly lost all patience with the Carter family's repeated appearances in his courtroom. "Mr. Carter," Judge Whitmore said, addressing Cornelius directly, his voice carrying the particular weariness of a man who had hoped never to see this family in his courtroom again. "You stand accused of conspiring to defraud investors in a shipping venture through deliberate sabotage, resulting in significant financial ruin to at least one family represented here today. You further stand accused of diverting trust funds under your management for personal use over a period of several years. How do you answer these charges?" Cornelius's lawyer rose to offer some careful technical defense about the difficulty of proving intent across a decade-old business arrangement, but the confession already secured from his former partner made the argument feel thin even before it finished being spoken, and the judge's expression suggested he found it every bit as unconvincing as Abigail did. It was Margaret called unexpectedly to testify to the family's financial state in the years following her husband's death, who delivered the testimony that seemed to finally close whatever narrow gap remained for doubt. "My husband died believing he had failed his family through poor judgment," Margaret said, her voice steady, despite the visible effort it cost her. "He carried that shame every day until it broke something in him that never fully healed. I watched a good man die slowly of guilt for a crime someone else committed against him. I would like the court to understand that whatever financial ruin resulted from Mr. Carter's actions, the deepest cost was never measured in dollars. It was measured in a man who never once knew he'd been robbed, rather than ruined by his own poor choices, and who went to his grave never getting the chance to know the difference." The courtroom went entirely silent. Judge Whitmore's ruling, when it came, left little room for further appeal, full restitution to the Harper estate for losses traced directly to the fraudulent venture, immediate forfeiture of Cornelius's remaining property to satisfy the trusteeship audit's findings, and a formal referral for criminal prosecution, given the scale and premeditation of the fraud involved. Cornelius Carter was led from the courthouse in handcuffs, and Abigail felt watching him go, not triumph exactly, but something quieter and more complete, the particular piece of a truth finally spoken aloud after being buried for over a decade beneath grief no one had understood the true shape of. Spring settled into the county with an unusual gentleness that year, as though the land itself had exhaled after months of storm, and Abigail spent the growing weeks of her pregnancy in the particular contentment of a woman finally free of every debt and doubt that had shadowed her since her father's death. The rebuilt Harper house stood finished now, handsome and solid on the same foundation as the old one, and Margaret had taken to filling it with the particular fussy energy of a woman determined to make up for lost time. Planting a garden she'd never had the resources to plant before, insisting Charlotte learn every household skill Margaret herself had let slip during the years of quiet desperation, writing long, warm letters to Abigail nearly every week despite living close enough to visit daily. Charlotte, for her part, had found something of her own that spring, a quiet, steady young man named Thomas Whitfield, the youngest son of a modest but respectable family, who had none of Nathaniel's wealth or reputation, but possessed, according to Charlotte's flushed and happy account, a gentleness that made her feel for the first time in her life chosen rather than arranged. "Mother didn't even try to interfere," Charlotte told Abigail one afternoon, practically glowing with the novelty of it. "She simply asked if he made me happy, and when I said yes, she said that was enough. Can you imagine, a year ago she would have had him investigated for his family's land holdings before permitting a single conversation. A year changes a great deal," Abigail said, smiling, one hand resting on the now considerable curve of her belly. "I'm glad she's learned to ask the right question, even if it took losing nearly everything to teach her." "I'm glad you're happy," Charlotte said, more serious now, taking her sister's hand. "I used to think happiness was something that happened to other people. People prettier than me, or luckier or better liked. I don't think that anymore. I think it's something you build the way you and Nathaniel built yours, out of whatever hard, unglamorous material happens to be lying around when you need it most." The baby arrived in the first week of June, nearly a full year to the day since Nathaniel Carter had walked past 40 eligible women in a Virginia ballroom to ask a forgotten girl in a faded dress for the first dance. The labor was long and difficult enough that Nathaniel spent the better part of a night pacing the hallway outside their bedroom, while Mrs. Brooks and the midwife worked his composure. That careful, guarded stillness the whole county still believed defined him. Cracking entirely under the strain of waiting for news, he had no power to hasten. When the cry finally came, thin and furious and unmistakably alive, Nathaniel was through the door before anyone thought to stop him, and found Abigail exhausted and radiant, a small red-faced bundle held carefully against her chest. A daughter. Mrs. Brooks said, her own eyes wet, watching the two of them with the particular satisfaction of a woman who had known both of them long enough to understand exactly how much this moment meant. Healthy, strong-lunged, and already, if I'm any judge, possessed of her mother's stubbornness. Nathaniel knelt beside the bed, reaching out with a hand that trembled slightly, and touched the small, impossibly soft curve of his daughter's cheek, with a reverence Abigail had never seen him show anything else in the world. "She's perfect," he said, his voice rough. "She's ours," Abigail corrected gently, echoing the words he'd once said to her in wonder, and watched something break open in his face. Joy unguarded and complete the last of whatever cold armor the county had spent years attributing to him, finally entirely gone. They named her Eleanor after Mrs. Brooks, whose quiet, steady kindness had steered Abigail through the darkest weeks of that first terrible summer, and who wept openly upon hearing the news, insisting between tears that she had never in 60 years of service been honored so completely by anyone. The christening held that August at the same church where Abigail and Nathaniel had married a year before drew a crowd that felt this time entirely different in character from the curious, skeptical gathering of the wedding day. There was no whispered speculation this time about hasty marriages or questionable motives. There was only a county that had watched over the course of a single remarkable year, a forgotten girl become a woman whose quiet strength had exposed one man's decade-long fraud, dismantled another man's careful theft, rebuilt her own family's fortune and reputation, and married a man. The whole of Virginia had once believed incapable of warmth, only to discover alongside everyone else that the coldness had never been the truth of him at all, merely the absence of anyone worth thawing for. Victoria Ashford attended seated near the back and approached Abigail after the ceremony with none of the cold assessment she'd carried the year before. "She's beautiful," Victoria said, looking down at Eleanor with an expression that seemed for once entirely without calculation. "I owe you an apology, Mrs. Carter, beyond the one I offered before. I spent a year resenting you for something that was never truly yours to take from me. Nathaniel and I were never promised to each other, whatever my family wished to believe. I understand that now, watching the two of you together. Whatever this is, it was always going to be yours, not mine, and I was simply too proud to see it clearly at the time." "Thank you for saying so," Abigail said, and found to her own quiet surprise that she meant every word of the forgiveness in her voice. Josiah Pruitt attended as well, considerably less nervous than the man Nathaniel had once cornered in his office demanding answers about Margaret's debts, and offered his own congratulations with the particular relief of a lawyer who had watched a family crisis resolve itself far better than he'd ever dared hope during the darkest weeks of it. "I confess," he told Nathaniel quietly over the reception's modest refreshments, "I never expected any of this to end well. When Mrs. Harper first came to my office with those debts, I thought I was watching a family walk toward certain ruin. I've rarely been so pleased to be proven entirely wrong." "You weren't wrong about the danger," Nathaniel said, "only about whether we'd find our way through it." That evening, after the guests had gone, and Eleanor had finally settled into an exhausted milk-drunk sleep in the cradle, Nathaniel had built with his own hands through the long months of waiting. Abigail found her husband standing at the window of the nursery, watching the last light fade over land that had once belonged in part to a family he'd wronged without ever knowing it, and now belonged fully and rightfully to the daughter sleeping peacefully behind him. "You're thinking about your father," she said, coming to stand beside him. "I am." Nathaniel's voice was quiet, reflective. "I spent most of my life believing I understood him, a hard man, difficult but not dishonest. I've had to relearn a great deal about him this past year. About what he took, what he broke, what it cost your family to survive what he set in motion." He looked down at her, something searching in his expression. "I keep wondering whether Eleanor will grow up in the shadow of that history, whether she'll one day learn what her grandfather did, and wonder what that means about the family she was born into." "She'll learn," Abigail said, "that her grandfather did wrong, and that her father spent a year making it right at real cost to himself without waiting to be forced into it by a court or a scandal. She'll learn that the measure of a family isn't whether every generation gets everything correct, but whether each generation is willing to face what the last one got wrong and repair it honestly." She reached up, resting her palm against his jaw, the way she had 100 times now, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "That's not a shadow, Nathaniel. That's a foundation. I intend to raise our daughter to understand the difference." He turned his face into her palm, closing his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again, Whatever doubt had gathered there through the long day's celebration had settled into something steadier. "I love you," he said. "I don't think I said it plainly enough that first year. I was too busy proving it through debts settled and lawsuits won to simply say the words as often as you deserved to hear them." "You said it in every single thing you did," Abigail said. "But I'll never tire of hearing it plainly, too." "Then I'll say it every day for the rest of our lives," Nathaniel said. "Starting now. I love you, Abigail Carter. I loved you the moment I watched you drink water alone by a pillar, entirely unwilling to perform for a room that had already decided you weren't worth its attention. I have loved you through every debt and lawsuit and fire since, and I will love you through whatever this life still has waiting for us, for as long as I live, and considerably beyond it, if such a thing is possible." Abigail felt her eyes fill, not with the frightened, uncertain tears of that first ballroom night, but with something entirely different. The full, settled joy of a woman who had spent 6 years believing herself invisible, unworthy, forgotten by a world too busy counting the value of prettier, wealthier daughters, to notice the one quietly watching from the edges, and who had discovered in the end that the man who finally saw her clearly had never once needed her to be anything other than exactly who she already was. Years later, when the story of that summer was still told throughout the county, softened by time into something almost like legend, the details of debts and fraud and courtroom battles worn smooth into the simpler, sweeter shape of a love story. People preferred to remember. No one spoke first of the money that had been at stake, or the land, or even the scandal that had nearly unmade everything before it began. They spoke instead of a single moment in a crowded ballroom of a cold and celebrated man walking past every eligible woman in Virginia to stop before a girl the world had decided wasn't worth seeing, and of the quiet, unshakable truth that had followed from it ever after, that a person's worth was never decided by a ballroom's judgment, or a family's fortune, or the cruel arithmetic of who had been chosen and who had been overlooked. It was decided instead by the steady, unglamorous courage of showing up for the people who mattered, day after ordinary day, long after the music had stopped and the crowd had gone home, through debts settled and truths uncovered, through fires survived and families rebuilt, through every quiet, unremarkable Tuesday that never made it into anyone's telling of the story, but that had in the end built the whole of it. Abigail Carter never forgot what it felt like to be invisible. She simply refused for the rest of her life to let anyone else feel that way in a room she had the power to change. And in the county that had once overlooked her entirely, she became in time the woman everyone remembered first. The standard against which every story of quiet strength and hard-won love was measured from that summer forward, for as long as anyone in Virginia continued to tell the tale at all.